To his millions of fans, Barry Humphries is a genius.
Oh, darling, a lovely little face, too. Oh, I bet you were once an attractive woman.
The man that turned a suburban housewife into a global superstar. Put Australia on the map while ridiculing it.
I go all over the world, and I've met a lot of people who've never met an Australian before. And it's lovely to think that they judge you by me, ladies and gentlemen. It is!
Making a racist, lecherous drunk funny. Where have these comedy grotesques come from? On the surface, so cultured and civilized, what hidden side of Barry Humphries gave birth to his alter egos? We persuaded the notoriously private Barry Humphries to let us join him on his tour of Australia, to return to the places of his childhood and introduce us to some of his oldest friends.
Oh, good heavens.
Promised unparalleled access, we went in search of the man inside Dame Edna, though we were warned from the outset that it wouldn't be easy.
While I'm always flattered when people want to make documentaries about me, I do take a certain delight in giving away as little as possible.
Our journey into the mind of Barry Humphries began in the back of a Rolls-Royce driving through Melbourne.
This is a documentary about me. You won't be able to take your eyes off this little saga. Oh, there are going to be all kinds of things of interest. I'm an amazing person. I am regarded as one of the world's great beauties. And I think the most interesting thing will be my visit to Moonee Ponds, the well-nigh unrecognisable suburb of my childhood. Moonee. It's an Aboriginal word meaning a meeting of the waters. All Aboriginal words mean that. So it's not a difficult language.
Dame Edna is royalty here.
It's really good to have you back. You're a great Australian icon.
Oh, an icon, am
Yes.
And how are all your kids going? They're
Oh, well, my daughter Valma is a problem.
Oh, what's she up to?
Well, she's been in trouble.
Oh, God.
Shoplifting.
After 50 years on stage, Dame Edna clearly delights in being more famous than the man who discovered her.
Many times I've thought, I wonder if Edna ever thinks of Moonee Ponds.
I do. I put it on the world map.
Oh, indeed, you did indeed. It's the only suburb that visitors know in Melbourne.
Isn't that wonderful? Thanks to me.
Just like Edna, the roots of Barry Humphries' character are buried in the suburbs. These are the not-so-humble streets where Humphries was born in 1934.
Melbourne, in the days when I grew up, was a rather oppressive kind of place. There was a tremendous influence on cleanliness, for example. Cleanliness and niceness. Above all, one had to be very, very nice.
To unlock the memories of his childhood, we took Humphries back to the house in Christowell Street, where he grew up.
Now, what a novel, innovative idea.
I'm sitting in exactly the same spot where I had my photograph taken in my new prep school blazer, God knows how long ago. It's an estate with many houses built by my father, who was a builder and an architect. We would live in one, he'd sell it, and then we'd move into a slightly bigger one, so we were upgrading all the time. When the house was first built, there's a photograph of me standing there over one of my father's wonderful sprinklers. I think they were almost his invention. They worked for quite a while until the grass actually grew, and then the grass tended to choke the water.
Humphries clearly adored his successful father, Eric, who in turn indulged his son's every whim. His relationship with his mother, Louisa, is less straightforward.
My mother was a wonderful character. She was very withdrawn. She was very shy, in fact. She was very good at knowing what was common and what was not common. And I remember returning with her from what seemed to me a wonderful afternoon tea at the house of one of her friends. And I said to my mother, "That was a lovely cake." And my mother
It's just said one word. Bought. Bought.
From a very early age, it was clear he was not like other Australian boys, an impression his first teacher will never forget.
Quite unusual from the very word go. His ability with his English language was quite outstanding. In fact, the headmaster said, "Oh, don't put that in a school magazine, it makes the others look too amateurish." That's quite true, because he'd written something for the school magazine which was so much ahead of other children his age, and his ability to draw. He drew most beautifully. His history illustrations were so real. Yes, he was unusual from the very word go, I think.
My mother once said, you know, your father and I really don't know where you came from. And this feeling of being a cuckoo, a changeling perhaps, really upset me, because I thought perhaps I'm adopted. Perhaps I'm adopted, like poor Valerie Dunn up the road, whom we're not supposed to tell. I came home once and none of my books were there. And I said, what happened to my books? And she said, oh, you've read them. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, a nice man, she said, a nice man from the Salvation Army came and took them away. I was absolutely distraught. And for the rest of my life, I've been searching for replicas of these books.
The battle lines between Humphreys and the cultural wasteland of the suburbs had been drawn. 10 years later, this conflict would inspire him to create the second most important woman in his life, the woman who would make him famous. We're on a journey to find out about Barry Humphreys, the man inside Dame Edna. 50 years of fame and the trappings of success have clearly left their mark on this Melbourne housewife.
Sometimes when I come back to Australia, I'm ashamed of myself, because when I meet lovely Australians, warm-hearted, generous, adoring Australians, I feel I'm talking to kiddies. And that makes me very, very ashamed of myself, for fear that I'm getting a bit snobbish. Not as snobbish as Germaine Greer, though. That's better.
Unlike Edna, Humphreys was born with a silver spoon in his mouth.
I was brought up such a privileged, spoilt, comfortable child. But at the time I wasn't grateful. I bit the hand that fed me, and I treated my parents, in retrospect, rather badly.
His bewildered parents sent him to Melbourne's most conservative school, Melbourne Grammar, an exercise in mind control that failed from the outset.
He was a spectacular misfit who refused to conform. He was not a happy boy because it was not a very happy environment, but he did know how to survive. We had to go along to these football games and back the school and have our names marked off on the school roll, and Barry would do this, but he used to go and sit then with his back to the game, knitting on one occasion. And this would outrage the boys and the band of prefects who were supposed to impose order in the school, because there was nothing that they could do about this. There was nothing about the need to watch the game that you'd been obliged to attend, and there was nothing at all in the school rules about knitting.
Back at his old school, Humphreys strolls around the grounds with the air of a man who's had the last laugh. Indifference to his school days, however, evaporates fast when Humphreys discovers the Melbourne Grammar Archive now honours the erstwhile knitting misfit.
Oh, good heavens!
Look what we found in our archives.
I cannot believe this. Now, is this the school magazine?
That's the Melbourneian.
51 to 53.
That's right. And I think you've won a prize here.
Have I? There's me.
Yeah.
Yes, look, Original English Verse Prize.
There you go.
J.B. Humphreys. Any more pictures?
Well, we've got photos in here of some of your first productions, perhaps.
What?
We've got The Ghost Train.
The
Do you remember
Ghost
being in The
Train.
Ghost
I
Train?
remember, of course, being in the Ghost Train. I had quite a good part in the Ghost Train.
Okay.
And there, I played a sort of vamp. There. And this was in Ambrose Applejohn's Adventure. I had no wish to be an actor. I don't have any wish to be an actor now. It was a way of postponing adult life. That's how I see it still.
He was known as Queenie Humphreys, and the headmaster, I think, was deeply anxious about his preferences and how he might turn out and what kind of disgrace he might bring possibly on the entire school. And did say, I hope you're not going to turn out to be, I'm not sure what word he used, but it might even have been the word poofter.
I think my Who's Who entry in the late 60s might have been, I think it was, self-educated, attended Melbourne Grammar. How rude. This is wonderful down here, isn't it?
From Melbourne Grammar, he entered Melbourne University, the career path of convention.
I had a card printed. A friend of mine had a printing press, and I had my name printed on the card. I think I was the only person of that age with a visiting card. And it said, Barry Humphreys, dilettante, which was a pretentious thing to do, but then I was very, very pretentious.
His deep-rooted instinct to shock and disturb was as strong as ever. With a group of friends, he found the perfect cover for mischief.
Nothing in Australia had really been touched by Dadaism, and yet Australia seemed the perfect subject. Particularly in the early 1950s, the epoch of niceness. Its message of bad taste, of effrontery, of ferocity, really gave me a wonderful sensation of liberation and intensity. And neither of those things had been granted to me as a privileged suburban dweller.
His Dada works were bizarre, and wherever possible, jokes.
He used to create works like cakescapes. He'd get sponge cakes and smash them between two panes of glass and get really interesting kind of abstract textures. This was at art school in the 50s. And then he'd let them go mouldy because he said he wanted the greens to come out, and he would always talk about it in a very painterly kind of way. The one that always tickled me when I read about it was one of his exhibitions was a plinth, was 2 Wellington boots filled with custard. Puss in boots.
He became infamous in Melbourne during his avant-garde Dada period. And you must have heard the stories, the amazing stories where a stooge is sitting in a railway carriage and at each platform, as the train pulls in, another course of breakfast is proffered through the window.
He used to do mad things, like he'd get on a train and he'd have a valet with him and he'd start at the end of the line and he'd be in his pyjamas, and the next stop he'd get out and he'd put a shirt on and he'd do all this to get publicity in the paper. And he was always in the paper. You never really knew what he did. He never did many shows anywhere, but you always could read about Barry Humphreys doing things.
All kinds of stories are told about what we did, and I generally agree with the ones that are the funniest, because it's all lost in the mist of time.
But not quite as lost as he'd have us believe. Humphreys is an avid hoarder of his own memorabilia. The Melbourne Arts Centre houses costumes and props that span his whole career, all generously donated by Humphreys himself.
I see a lot of things I wished I'd never given away, of course.
And now they're in my clutches.
But they're in her clutches, but there's one satisfaction you have in knowing that I wouldn't fit into them anymore.
A trip down memory lane, especially in the company of a charming young archivist, lifts Humphreys' spirits.
How are you?
Very well.
You got my nice gloves ready for me? Good. How strange I should need gloves to handle things I never handled with gloves before. You've got a lot of things, haven't you? Now, I remember that.
Do you?
Oh.
How could you forget?
Now this. This is the Golden Goanna. I did a character some years ago now called Phil Philby, who was an Australian filmmaker. And he had a social conscience. And he made a film which was called Cage of Darkness, which is about discrimination against lesbianism in Australian Aboriginal prisons. And he, for this, had won the Golden Goanna, an Australian film award. And there are some things from my early Dadaist days. This is an interesting object. There used to be 2 of them. They were knitted on my instructions by my sister. And it's an obstetric glove. And it's a beautiful thing, isn't it? And this, I think, is a survivor of the Dada period. Yes, It's the single-breasted hat. It's a hat with a fly. So actually you can take it off backwards. Even when I was at school, I quite liked to startle people. It gave me a feeling of identity. Otherwise, in Australia, you disappear, vanish. So I really tried to remind myself of my own existence by doing things that alarmed or disturbed people. This was a product called Platytox that I invented for poisoning platypuses. And it says, Platytox is a new scientifically prepared killer, guaranteed to rid your district of platypuses, kangaroos, emus, lyrebirds, koalas, wallabies, kookaburras, and wombats. And then guaranteed harmless to whites. I consider myself really still a Dadaist. When I fill in a little form in the aeroplane, I always say Dadaist by occupation. No one's queried it at all. Unfortunately, I wish they had.
Despite the notoriety of his student exploits, Humphreys dropped out of university. He joined the Melbourne Theatre Company, and in 1955, whilst touring with Shakespeare's Twelfth Night, he found the inspiration for Edna.
On these long journeys, we improvised. People would sing songs, recite poetry, and I was at the back of the bus, and I used to impersonate the provincial arts lady, because whenever we took Shakespeare to a country town, afterwards there were sandwiches and cakes and cups of tea, and the local bluestocking, or the woman who'd read a few books, would stand up and thank us for bringing culture to their little town.
This was very, very funny. It wasn't Edna Everage, but it had all had all these sort of beginnings, I suppose, of Edna. He never ever set her in the country. It was always Moonee Ponds. And so she was a suburban lady, really. But she certainly took on a lot of the qualities of these country ladies who were entertaining us.
Dressed as a frumpy little woman, Humphreys was more original and funnier than he'd ever been as a Dadaist. Here, finally, was a way to break out of the suburban straitjacket he'd been fighting since birth, not by shunning it, but by embracing it.
But there's one thing we've got they haven't got anywhere else in the world, you know. Our wonderful Australian smile. Oh, you know, on my way back to Moonee Ponds from the airport, even the Venetian blinds seem to be smiling.
And I played this rather gauche, garrulous Melbourne housewife with a very shrill voice who was obsessed with interior decoration.
Every nuance of Edna was lurking in his DNA. Niceness, as ever, was the enemy, and now he was going to destroy it from the inside out. Inevitably, people began to wonder whether Edna was a pantomime version of his mother.
Ah, this is where the documentary goes in depth.
So, the question remains, is Edna Humphreys' revenge against the mother who dared give away those precious books?
I met Barry's mother towards the end of her life. I went to see her when she was in hospital with Barry. And clearly, there's quite a lot of Edna in that woman. But we're talking Mrs. Everage, not Dame Edna. They're completely different characters, as are Jekyll and Hyde.
It's easy to say that my mother is the chief inspiration for Dame Edna. And generally I go along with it, just for a quiet life. But she is really very much a composite of the women of that period and many women in Australia today.
By 1975, Humphreys and his evolving alter ego were based in London, conquering the West End with their sellout show Housewife Superstar. Finally, they were mixing with the right sort of people. The Melbourne housewife had by now been transformed into a gaudily dressed, acid-tongued egomaniac with a title. Dame Edna had arrived. She was the star, and lesser celebrities the sacrificial lambs to her twisted niceness.
Lord Longford. Would you agree we ought to take a much tougher line with pornography?
Well, some of it, I must admit, is a bit tame and could be a bit tougher. It's this macho thing that I've got into now, you know? My little hairdresser's introduced me to a way of life I never thought was possible. If ever you want a trim, I'll send him round here, darling.
The character of Dame Edna has a great advantage in that she knows nothing. She is a totally ignorant woman, and therefore can discuss any subject at all. It's a little bit like the President of the United States, you know, a dunce, really, who nonetheless controls the destiny of the world. Edna has a similar advantage.
Let me look at you!
Edna had gone from being the joke to being the joker. Today no one is safe, least of all her fans.
I'm looking at what you're wearing, darling. I'm trying to think of how to describe it. Affordable is the word that speaks to my mind. No.
This transformation has taken 50 years. And there are not many men who can trace their rise to the top through the mothballed wardrobe of a middle-aged woman.
This coat, purchased a long time ago, I think at Selfridge's, was the last thing Edna ever bought off the hook. Everything else since has been made. That's a very early marsupial dress. And a marsupial means having a pocket, of course, and this has a lovely koala pocket. And this was another dress which Edna wore in an interview with Lauren Bacall.
That look, that beautiful Bacall look. I don't know whether I can do it. The little look you had. I'll try. That was it, wasn't it?
Well, almost.
Isn't that spooky?
This is a homage to Edvard Munch. And there was a small recording box, and these actually screamed.
It's inspired by a marvellous, marvellous painting, The Scream by Munch. Isn't that gorgeous?
This is when Edna was a tree. It's the Sydney Opera House dress. A beautiful dress.
You know, Kylie's just joined. She's in the
Kylie's
wardrobe
tough.
next to you.
I'm in the next wardrobe to Kylie Minogue, isn't that nice? But it's whetted my appetite. I've forgotten, of course, how many memories it triggers and how many memories it doesn't trigger.
Just as it appears we're getting closer to the real man, someone else insists on butting in. Fighting as ever for the limelight.
People ask me the secret of my success, and I think it's obvious. I'm real. I'm a person. Prick me and I bleed. I'm human.
But Edna is not the only character to escape flesh and blood from the Humphreys psyche.
You can strike a match on this old tart's face, I'm telling you.
Even more shocking than Edna, what dark side of Humphreys is exorcised through Sir Les Patterson?
I just had a trouser cough. I did.
Dark side. How fascinating.
Debbie, you lovely, vivid little thing. Where do you live? Wollongong.
Australia's greatest comedian, Barry Humphries, is best known for his mocking creation, Dame Edna.
No, but there are some nice homes there, aren't there? You live anywhere near them, do you, Debbie? What? No.
However, she is not the whole story. Throughout the 60s, his shows featured a whole cast of characters. From a dropout surfer to a sleazy trade union official. By the mid-70s, though, Humphries had found the three characters with which to take on the world. Edna, the grandfatherly Sandy Stone...
Permit me if I may. Permit me.
And the granddaddy of political incorrectness, Sir Les Patterson.
My name is Les Patterson.
We track down Sir Les to an exclusive Melbourne bar. His relationship with Humphries, like so much else about the comedian, is murky.
I've met Barry Humphries only about twice in my life, and it was 2 times too many. He's up himself, and I don't get the point of him. He's not my type, and he is not a good representative for Australia. That's all I want to say. I'm saying no more.
Les Patterson is the most enjoyable character. No story is too filthy, no gesture too lewd, no idea too racist that he cannot articulate it with his own special kind of joy. Les is vulgarity on roller skates.
Oh, there's a stony-faced old Sheila sitting down here. Oh, she's got a head on her like a half-sucked mango, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing personal, madam. Nothing personal, I assure you.
Sir Les Patterson is Barry Humphrey's rant against political vanity and a certain kind of Australian masculinity.
We were invited to a drinks party at the Australian Embassy, or the Australian consul in London. And Barry, we got there, and the consul was pulling drinks out of the fridge. I could see Barry looking at him with these burning eyes. And I thought, what's Barry looking at? He seems to be very interested in this guy. He was watching him like a hawk the whole evening. And then the next thing I saw, Les Patterson appeared.
Listen, I was born the way I was born. I was worried when I was a kid, Holly. I don't think I've told you this. I was worried that I was a bit deformed down there in the wedding tackle area. But you've never complained, have you?
No.
Holly and I go back a long way. You said last night, I remember, Les, you go back a long way.
Les is fairly close to the real thing. There are a number of Australian politicians exactly like Les Patterson. Worse. Much worse.
There was a superstition that Australia didn't have any culture at all. But my theme was, we have culture coming out of our arseholes.
I often find myself cringing, and it is very crude, but I've met so many Australians like Les Patterson that I recognise the truth in the character.
There were even questions raised in the Australian Parliament. Should Les Patterson, or should Barry Humphries really be allowed to present Les Patterson abroad?
I go to the Far East a bit, and I've got little mates there of the opposite sex persuasion. And I have a very nice time in Bangkok. I'm very careful, though. I've never picked anything up that's lasted for very long.
He's more than a cartoon. There is a third dimension to Les that comes from inside Humphries himself.
He does all the things that I try not to do. He smokes, for example. And he's deplorably promiscuous, or wishes he were. No research assistant is safe in his company, but he's oddly attractive to women.
And then there is Sir Les's fondness for a drink, something that Humphries knows more about than most.
There was a period when he was drinking so heavily that it looked as if he might not be able to get himself together as a human being, let alone as an entertainer ever again.
It's fair to say that Barry's career was going down the toilet. He had a huge drinking problem, which he makes no secret of.
My addiction to alcohol was, at one stage in the late 1960s, a life-threatening problem. I have certainly a serious health problem, and it, of course, affected all my relationships, so that my marriage collapsed, really as a direct result of this.
Chardonnay, Chardonnay, it's the upmarket drink of today. Although it's not fizzy, it's a beaut aphrodisiac when you're in need of a lay.
Today, Les is the opposite of everything Humphries holds dear, but it's his old demons that keep Les alive.
Look, when you go to the dry cleaner, you give them, you have to tell them what the stains are. It helps them, doesn't it? I just write them on a bit of paper and give them across. I said, look at it when I've left the shop. They usually say, look, is it vomit, sperm, or blood? You know what I tell them? A bit of everything.
Sir Les and Dame Edna let Humphries get away with comedy murder. The rampant sexism, casual racism and mocking cruelty are not his flaws, obviously, but theirs. But just as this neat trick starts making sense, Humphries confuses things with his third persona, Sandy Stone, an old man trapped in the certainties of pre-war Australia.
Telegrams are a thing of the past, like bank managers, or blotting paper, or typewriters, or made in England.
He's the only character of Barry's that has any compassion, or that Barry has compassion for. He's the gentle, the soft, the bewildered, the overwhelmed character, where most of Barry's other characters are alpha males, alpha females. I don't know where Sandy sits on the alphabet, but somewhere near Z.
Humphreys and his characters are now so entwined that many find it hard to discern where they finish and the real Humphreys begins.
I think that in many ways Barry's characters are more real than Barry. If you look at the immense sort of phallic energies of Celeste.
I know what you're staring at, darling. You're looking at my penis, aren't you? And there he is, ladies and gentlemen, there he is, yes!
If you look at the huge scale of Edna.
And choosing a glamorous frock! Yeah!
And you compare it to Barry, who still remains the dandy, the sort of Edwardian wit, a touch of the Oscar Wilde. There's a great distance, but I find Barry as a character, Barry as Barry, less convincing, far less convincing than his characters on stage or on screen.
Philip Larkin has a line about some mothers in a park saying something has pushed them to the corner of their own lives, and it may be that the same fate has overtaken Barry, that he's been pushed to the corner of his own life by this extraordinary figure that he's created, or several of the extraordinary figures that he's created, who seem sometimes larger and more vivid, incredible though this may sound, than he himself.
I don't really think about any of my stage characters unless I'm on the stage performing them. Frankly, I don't feel in any sense marginalised by the character of Dame Edna, as some people, I think, entertain themselves by imagining that I am.
So how real is the debonair art lover that Humphreys now casts himself as? We followed him and an old friend, Ed Clark, to a local arts auction in Melbourne to see for ourselves.
These film-making people are devilishly cunning. There was I, thinking I was just looking for a new painting with an old chum. Harold Herbert, not bad. Looks as though it might have hung in a dentist's waiting room for a long, long time. There's a Carrick Fox. Is it? It's a Taylor Gee. You can understand the family wanting to sell.
That's coming up in August, then.
Between you and me, it's the frame I'm interested in.
Oh, right, okay, yes.
Being a painter myself, I'm very pleased to see so much bad art because I realise how very good I am. I still do a lot of landscapes. The last exhibition I had, which was in Melbourne early this year, was of landscape paintings. And that's meditation for me. It's wonderfully serene. I'm an actor who paints. I am an artist. I like to say to people, and certainly to my wife's irritation, I look at the world through the eyes of an artist. Look at that. What will that fetch? That is macrame. Very popular in the 60s.
He's such a fan of paintings that he likes that I've known him go to extremes to buy them. And I mean, he told me that he has some of his paintings, his most treasured ones, he's bought 4 times. Because when he had the painting and he got divorced and his wife took the painting and put it into auction and he went and bought it again, and that's happened then successfully. He's had to buy the picture over and over in order to get it back.
But I'm an accumulator more than a collector.
What do you collect?
And I'm a disperser sometimes, rather reluctant disperser.
Why is that? Is that because of your several marriages?
Well, that's putting rather a fine point on it.
There's a Tom Peerless over here. He's an interesting Tom Peerless. Do you remember him?
Barry Humphreys has conquered the suburbs, obscurity and drink. Yet there is another addiction he has still to overcome. A weakness that might be the real secret behind the man inside Dame Edna. As Barry Humphreys' tour rolls into Adelaide for its final stop, it becomes clear that Humphreys has divided up the work of touring. While the man himself may sign the odd autograph, he has abdicated the hard graft of publicity to someone else. It is Dame Edna who basks in the glory, which, if we are to take her word for it, Barry Humphreys can take little credit for.
Hello, media.
Dame Edna, Barry Humphries got the CBE. Are you jealous of that when you do all the work?
This man who is my manager, do you know what a manager is, kiddies? He takes some of my money for doing practically nothing. And the Queen gave him a little title just to keep him happy. And do you know why she did? I told her to.
The dominance of Edna begs the question, who's controlling whom? Even Humphries can't deny she has a life of her own.
Oh, I think when Edna emerges from her dressing room, she is herself. There is never any thought that Edna might conceal an actor. That would be a horrible idea, and I don't think about this consciously at all, really. It's just an amusing thing that I do.
There we go.
There are certain questions that I get very regularly asked. One is, am I Edna? Is Edna my mother? Do I hate Australia? I hear these questions so often that it's difficult for me to actually contain myself in answering them, because a terrible weariness comes over me. I say, oh, not that one again.
Those who know Humphries best, however, are as intrigued as we are by the conflicts at work behind the comedy.
I think he is a very complicated, multiple personality. It's very difficult to capture him. You can what we've been talking about is particular characters that he's captured and we can describe. But can we describe him? There are a lot of hims there.
It ain't simple. His complexity is echoed by the complexity of our relationship to him, and I speak now as an Australian. He confuses us, he worries us, he antagonises us. We're proud of him, and yet many of us would cheerfully throttle him.
He's certainly the most successful Australian comic actor ever, so far. There's no one else that even comes anywhere near him. Who else could you think of?
What twaddle?
Barry's range of illusion.
Twaddle.
And joining me live in the studio, Dame Edna.
I will be back in England soon, because they're doing a documentary film about me.
I haven't noticed any drop-off in his energy level or in his memory over the years. I mean,
I like anything beginning with G.
Do you really?
I've got a lot of G spots.
I think he's the only authentic Australian genie.
No, I love my public. I'm adored.
Oh, for God's sake.
If anything happened to me...
What's he doing?
Does that woman really think we're interested in her? It's tragic.
Humphries' first instinct is to undermine any profound attempt to understand his life. But once inside a theatre, the guard drops. Finally, Humphries appears at ease, the master entertainer simply getting on with the job.
Oh, think. I first performed here in 1953. So you see, it's tiny. Really, it's about the smallest theatre I've ever played. And yet I do remember, very early on, when I did my first one-man show here, I came into theatre and I thought, it's huge, will we ever fill it? I really don't have much of a voice, so I have to get the instrument a little lubricated.
We find ways to motivate him. One of those ways is obviously two beautiful girls assisting him with his stretching. That seems to always make the session more favorable.
It's a little erotic exercise that we do every night. It's got nothing to do with exercise, in fact. Am I flexible?
Yeah, you're very flexible.
Though each one of his shows lasts an exhausting 2.5 hours, even at 73, Humphries revels in it. The ecstasy of being centre stage, whether at home, at school, university, or the West End, is clearly the drug that has always driven Humphries, the one addiction he has no intention of beating.
I look down, I see such beautiful people looking up at me, drinking in my words, faces, the faces of terror.
I remember going to the theatre with my mother, and she would nudge me and she'd say, isn't it pathetic at his age, you know, referring to a matinee idol far past his prime. But Edna still seems to have a lot of energy left. And I am tremendously energetic.
In a word, adulation. It's adulation. That's the fuel. That's what gets him up on stage.
And I'm ready for action, ladies. I am ready for action.
Even when he's about to leave the stage, he can't resist going from the rear of the curtain and sticking his hand out under the curtain for a little bit more applause.
There's no difference between me and you, except I'm rich and talented and you're not. That's all.
The idea of Humphreys as a performance junkie is the one theory that he himself seems happy to consider.
The things I do in the theatre amuse me, and that's the only reason I do it. I do this entirely for my own pleasure.